Did you really think she'd understand that? Richard Whitmore's voice cut clean across the table, low but deliberate, the kind of tone meant to be overheard without ever sounding like it tried. A few suited men chuckled under their breath. Crystal glasses caught the warm chandelier light, scattering it across polished silverware and white linen like fragments of something too expensive to notice. Naomi Carter stood just to his right, posture straight, tray balanced lightly against her fingertips, her reflection faint in the mirrored wall behind the bar. She didn't react. Not when he switched into French. Not when he leaned slightly toward his business partner and repeated the sentence again, slower this time, sharper, deliberately mispronouncing a key phrase as if it were a private joke. The partner hesitated, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second, but said nothing. Around them, the restaurant hummed softly, cutlery tapping porcelain, a distant laugh, the low thrum of conversation layered like background music no one consciously heard. Richard smiled, satisfied, his cufflinks catching the light as he reached for his wine. To him, Naomi was part of that background, another invisible detail in a room he owned simply by sitting in it. Naomi stepped forward smoothly, setting down the next glass with quiet precision. Her movements were practiced, efficient, almost weightless. But her eyes, steady, observant, lingered for just a moment longer than expected on the open folder near Richard's elbow. A contract. Thick, cream-colored paper. French text running in dense, elegant lines across the page. Her fingers tightened just slightly around the edge of the tray, not enough for anyone to notice, just enough for her to feel it. Richard spoke again, this time louder, still in French, still careless, the words drifting into the space like smoke curling toward the ceiling. Another chuckle followed, a little louder now, encouraged. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else checked their phone. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose, almost imperceptible. 8 hours into her shift. For more to go. Rent due in 6 days. Hospital bill already overdue. Life had taught her when to stay silent. It had also taught her what silence cost. The light above flickered faintly against the surface of the wine glass as she adjusted it by less than an inch, aligning it perfectly with the plate. Small details mattered. They always had. Richard leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his performance, unaware of the slight tension now threading through the table, subtle but real. His partner glanced once more at the document, then at him, uncertainty flickering and disappearing just as quickly. Naomi's gaze dropped again to the page, scanning without seeming to. A phrase. A clause. One word used where another should have been. Not a mistake. A shift. Meaning bending quietly beneath polished language. Her grip on the tray steadied. The room didn't change. The light didn't change. The low hum of voices continued, uninterrupted. But something inside that stillness tilted, just slightly, like the moment before a glass slips from the edge of a table, suspended between falling and staying exactly where it is. Naomi moved away from the table without a sound, the tray still balanced in her hand, her pace measured, controlled, as if nothing at all had shifted inside her, but behind the calm rhythm of her steps her mind was already working, pulling apart the sentence she had just heard, the misplaced verb, the softened obligation hidden inside what should have been a firm condition. The kind of subtle distortion that did not raise alarms unless you knew exactly where to look. And she did. She always had. Long before late shifts and unpaid bills became the center of her life. Back when her world was filled with lecture halls and annotated margins and professors who spoke about language like it was architecture, precise and unforgiving. Back when she learned that one word could cost millions if it bent the wrong way. She reached the service station and set the tray down gently, the metal surface cool under her fingertips, grounding her, the distant hum of the restaurant continuing as if the air itself had not just tightened. She glanced once toward the table again. Just once. Richard Whitmore now speaking with more confidence, his tone relaxed. Unaware, his partner nodding slowly but not fully convinced, the hesitation still there, small but real. Naomi's jaw set slightly as she looked away. This was not her place. It never was. She was here to refill glasses, clear plates, disappear. That was the agreement the world had made with her, and most days she followed it without question. Because following it meant keeping the job, and keeping the job meant keeping everything else barely held together, her mother's medication, the rent, the quiet promise she had made to herself that she would not fall apart no matter how narrow things became. But knowledge does not disappear just because life changes. It waits, it listens, and when it recognizes something wrong, it does not stay quiet easily. Naomi reached for a clean cloth and wiped an already spotless surface, her movements automatic, her thoughts not. The phrase echoed again in her mind, clearer this time, sharper, the implication unfolding fully now. It was not just awkward, it was dangerous. It shifted responsibility. It created an opening, a loophole dressed as flexibility, the kind that looked harmless until it was enforced, until it was too late to take back. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Across the room a glass clinked. Someone laughed. A server passed behind her carrying a tray of entrees. The ordinary continued, unchanged. But at that table something had already started moving in the wrong direction. Naomi pressed her fingertips lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding again. She knew what would happen if she said nothing. The deal would move forward, signatures would follow, consequences would come later, quietly at first, then all at once, and no one in that room would remember the moment it could have been stopped, because the moment looked like nothing, just another sentence spoken in a language most of them did not fully understand. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. The reflection in the stainless steel surface staring back at her, composed, controlled, but no longer undecided. The distance between where she stood and that table felt longer now, heavier, not because of space, but because of everything it represented, the line she was not supposed to cross, the role she was expected to stay inside. Naomi picked up the water pitcher, her grip steady, her posture unchanged, and began walking back toward the table, each step quiet, deliberate, the kind of movement no one notices until it is already too late to ignore. Naomi reached the table just as Richard Whitmore lifted his glass again, the conversation flowing forward with a confidence that did not match the uncertainty beneath it. She stepped in quietly, refilling water with a steady hand, the stream clear and controlled as it met the rim of each glass without a sound. No one looked at her at first, no one ever did, until she spoke. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice calm, even, not loud, but precise enough to cut through the layered hum of voices around them. Richard paused mid-sentence, the slightest flicker of irritation crossing his face as his eyes shifted toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge an interruption he did not appreciate. "Yes?" he said, the word short, clipped, already dismissive. Naomi did not rush, did not shrink. She set the pitcher down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table before meeting his gaze fully for the first time. "The phrase you used earlier," she continued, her tone respectful but steady. "It does not mean what you think it means in this context." A brief silence followed, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that unsettles. Richard let out a soft laugh, turning slightly toward his partner as if to share the moment. "And you would know that how?" he asked, switching back to English now, his voice carrying just enough edge to invite amusement. A couple of men smiled politely, unsure whether to engage or stay neutral. Naomi did not react to the shift. "Because the structure changes the obligation," she said, her words measured, careful. "It makes the clause optional instead of binding." Richard's smile tightened, not gone, but thinner now. "I think I understand the language well enough," he replied, leaning back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the stem of his glass, the faint sound echoing sharper than it should have. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the response without accepting it. "Of course, sir," she said, then continued. "But the verb form you used suggests discretion, not requirement, and in legal terms that can be interpreted differently than intended." This time the silence deepened. His partner shifted in his seat, glancing down at the document again, slower now, more deliberate. Richard's expression remained composed, but something behind it had changed, something less certain. "Are you suggesting I made a mistake?" he asked. The question framed lightly, but carrying weight underneath. Naomi held her posture, shoulders relaxed, hands still at her sides. "I am suggesting there may be a risk if it is not clarified," she answered, her voice unchanged, not defensive, not challenging, just clear. Across the table one of the executives leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the page. Another reached for his reading glasses. The room had not stopped, but it had shifted. The Easy rhythm replaced by something tighter, more focused. Richard's gaze lingered on Naomi now, longer than before, assessing, recalculating, as if seeing her for the first time and not liking what that meant. "And where exactly did you learn to interpret contracts?" he asked, the hint of skepticism returning, quieter this time. Naomi did not hesitate. "I studied linguistics with a focus on legal translation," she said simply, no embellishment, no attempt to impress, just a fact placed calmly. Between them, the partner across from Richard looked up fully now, interest clear in his expression, while Richard remained still, the faint reflection of the chandelier light flickering across his cufflinks, the room waiting, not openly, but unmistakably, for what he would do next. Richard did not answer immediately, and that was the first crack, small but visible, the kind that only appeared when control slipped just enough to be noticed. His fingers stopped tapping against the glass, the faint rhythm gone, replaced by stillness that felt heavier than movement. He looked down at the document, then back at Naomi, then at his partner, as if recalibrating the room in real time. "You studied linguistics," he repeated, slower now. The earlier edge softened but not gone, more cautious than dismissive. Naomi nodded once, her posture unchanged, the quiet steadiness of someone who had already said what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. Across the table his partner leaned forward, pulling the contract closer, scanning the line Naomi had referenced, his brow tightening as he read, lips pressing together. "Which clause?" he asked, not looking at Richard, but at Naomi. The shift subtle but unmistakable. Naomi stepped slightly closer, careful not to intrude, and indicated the section with a small, precise motion of her hand. "Second paragraph, third line," she said, her voice even. "The verb implies discretion rather than obligation." The partner followed her indication, reading again, slower this time, translating silently, the room narrowing around that single page. Richard watched him, the confidence in his posture holding, but the certainty behind it thinning. "It is standard phrasing," Richard said, though the conviction was no longer absolute. More defensive than assured, the partner did not respond immediately, his eyes still moving across the text, then stopping, then going back, as if something did not settle the way it should. "Not exactly," he murmured finally, almost to himself, then looked up, this time directly at Richard. She might be right. The words landed softly, but their weight spread quickly, subtle reactions rippling across the table, a shift in posture here, a glance exchanged there, the quiet recalculation of risk that no one wanted to say out loud. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not visibly to most, but enough. He leaned forward, pulling the document toward himself now, his movements controlled, deliberate. He scanned the line again, lips barely moving as he translated, once, then again, slower, the same phrase, the same word, now carrying a different meaning than it had just moments ago. Naomi remained still, hands relaxed at her sides, not pressing, not adding, simply present. The chandelier light reflected faintly along the edge of the paper as Richard's gaze lingered, the silence stretching just enough to be felt. No one interrupted, no one filled it, because now the room understood that something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of what came next. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then looked up, not at his partner, but at Naomi, his expression no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but searching, measuring, as if trying to place her in a framework that no longer fit. "And your interpretation," he said, choosing each word carefully, "would suggest what exactly?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady, grounded, "That the clause allows the other party to opt out of the obligation without penalty," she said, the clarity of it cutting through the room like a line drawn clean and sharp. The partner leaned back slightly, processing, while another executive reached for a pen, marking something in the margin. The conversation had not resumed, it had transformed, and for the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore was no longer the one defining it. The words settled over the table like a weight no one could shift, not quickly, not cleanly, and for a moment no one spoke, the kind of silence that did not belong in a room like this, where conversations were usually fast, decisive, controlled. Richard's eyes dropped back to the document again. But this time there was no performance in the movement, no subtle display of authority, just focus, tight and deliberate. He read the line again, slower than before, translating each word with care, his mind adjusting, recalculating, and the more he read, the more the certainty he had carried into the evening began to thin, not vanish, but weaken. His partner leaned forward again, one finger resting lightly against the page as if holding the place steady. If that interpretation holds, he said quietly, then enforcement becomes optional. The sentence hung there, unfinished but understood. Another executive shifted in his chair, the soft creak of leather suddenly louder than it should have been. Someone else reached for their glass, but did not. Drink. Richard exhaled through his nose, controlled, contained, but the tension had moved into his shoulders now, subtle, but real. He straightened slightly, lifting his gaze from the page to Naomi again, measuring her, not dismissing her now, not overlooking her, but trying to understand the gap between what he assumed and what stood in front of him. You are saying this could cost us leverage, he said, more statement than question. Naomi did not rush her answer, did not soften it either. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice steady, grounded. It gives the other party room to reinterpret the agreement if conditions shift. Another pause followed, deeper this time. The implications moving through the room, not loudly, but thoroughly. Richard leaned back slowly, the chair barely making a sound, his fingers coming together loosely in front of him, a posture he used when thinking, when reassessing. When the outcome was no longer guaranteed, across from him, his partner closed the folder. Halfway, not fully, just enough to signal hesitation. We should clarify this before proceeding, he said, his tone careful, professional, but no longer aligned with Richard's earlier certainty. That shift, small as it was, carried weight. It redirected the momentum of the entire meeting. Richard's gaze moved from him to the others at the table, reading the room the way he always had. But this time the signals were different, less predictable, less controlled. The authority he held was still there, but it was no longer unquestioned. Not in this moment, not on this point. Naomi remained where she stood, not stepping back, not stepping forward, simply present, her role unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning. The light above reflected softly along the edge of the glassware, the same as before, the same room, the same people, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Richard looked down once more at the document, then closed it fully, the sound quiet. Final. He placed his hand on top of it for a brief second, as if grounding the decision before lifting his eyes again, this time not with dismissal, not with challenge, but with something closer to acknowledgement, restrained, controlled, but unmistakable. We will review the language, he said, the words measured, deliberate, the authority still there, but now redirected. The conversation began to move again, slower, more cautious, questions forming where certainty had been. And through it all, Naomi Carter stood at the edge of the table, no longer invisible, no longer just part of the background, but the reason the room had stopped, and the reason it had not yet fully recovered. The conversation resumed, but not the way it had before, the easy rhythm replaced by something more careful, more deliberate, as if every word now carried weight that had not been there minutes earlier. Richard Whitmore sat slightly back in his chair, no longer leaning forward with effortless control, his gaze lowered to the closed folder in front of him, not reading now, just resting there, absorbing, recalibrating. The soft glow of the chandelier reflected faintly across the polished surface of the table, catching the edge of the glass beside his hand. Untouched, the room moved around him in low currents, voices quieter, questions forming in measured tones, his partner speaking with one of the executives in a low voice, pointing again to the section Naomi had identified, their discussion precise, contained, no longer casual. Naomi stepped back from the table slowly, not retreating, just returning to the space she had occupied before, the narrow line between presence and invisibility, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her breathing steady, controlled, as if nothing inside her had shifted, but it had, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt, the kind of shift that comes when something long held in silence finally finds its place in the open. She glanced once toward the table again, just once, then lowered her gaze, focusing on the small details that had always grounded her. The alignment of the cutlery, the reflection in the glass, the quiet order of objects that did not question her place in the world. Across the room, a server passed by with a tray of plates, the scent of warm food drifting briefly through the air before. Fading, ordinary, steady, unchanged, Richard finally lifted his head again, his eyes moving not to the document, not to his partner, but to Naomi, the distance between them unchanged in space, but altered in meaning. He watched her for a moment, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something quieter, more complex, the kind of look that comes when a fixed assumption no longer holds. His fingers shifted slightly against the table, then stilled again, as if even that small movement required more thought than before. The conversation at the table continued, but he did not rejoin it immediately. Instead, he remained still, observing, listening, something he was not used to doing in a room where he usually led every direction. Naomi adjusted the position of a glass by a fraction of an inch, the motion precise, almost ritual, her reflection flickering across its surface, steady, composed. The same outwardly, yet not the same, because now the room had seen her, not fully, not completely, but enough, and that could not be undone. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, then leaned forward again, not with the same certainty as before, but with intention, his hand resting lightly on the closed folder, not opening it yet, just holding it there, as if acknowledging that the moment had changed something fundamental, not just in the document, but in the way he understood the space around him. And in that quiet, suspended pause between what had been and what would come next, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting, not for noise, not for action, but for recognition that something small, almost invisible, had just altered the balance of power in a way no one had expected. It was the partner who broke the silence first, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a shift in tone that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. He straightened slightly, one hand resting on the open page, and spoke in fluent French this time, slower, precise, repeating the clause as it should have been structured, the difference subtle to an untrained ear, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language fully. The words settled differently, firmer, binding, leaving no room for reinterpretation, and as he spoke, a faint change moved through the room, not visible, but felt, like a current adjusting direction. Richard's gaze followed every word, his attention locked now, not on the performance of control, but on the substance he had nearly misread. When the partner finished, he leaned back slightly and exhaled. "That is not what we had on the table," he said quietly, the understatement deliberate. Another executive nodded once, already flipping through his notes, cross-referencing, confirming, the realization spreading with quiet efficiency. This was not a minor nuance, not a stylistic preference. It was structural, financial, real. Richard's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the folder, then released, the gesture small, but it carried the weight of recalculation. "If we had signed that as stated," the partner continued, now switching back to English, "we would have allowed discretionary exit without penalty under shifting conditions." He did not need to finish the thought. The implication filled the space on its own. Millions, leverage, control, all of it hanging in that single corrected phrase. Richard nodded once, slowly, the motion controlled but no longer effortless, his authority still present, but now grounded in acknowledgement rather than assumption. He looked down at the document one more time, then closed it again with more intention than before, not dismissing it, but containing it, resetting it. When he looked up, his gaze moved directly to Naomi. No hesitation this time, no deflection, just recognition, clear and unambiguous. "You prevented a misstep," he said, the words measured, not dramatic, but real. The room absorbed that statement quietly, because it did not come easily, not from him, not in a setting like this. Naomi did not move, did not react beyond the slightest shift of her shoulders settling into stillness. "I only clarified what was already there," she replied, her voice even, not claiming more than she had done, not diminishing it either. Richard studied her for a moment, longer than before. the space between them holding a different kind of tension now, not dismissive, not defensive, but reflective, as if he was seeing not just her presence, but the gap in his own perception, the assumption he had made without question, the ease with which he had overlooked her, and the cost that could have followed. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but deliberate, then turned slightly toward his team. "We revised before proceeding," he said, the direction clear, grounded, the meeting shifting fully into a new phase, slower, sharper, more precise, and as the conversation resumed with renewed focus, Naomi stepped back once more into the quiet edge of the room, her role outwardly unchanged, but the space she occupied no longer the same, because now, even in the low hum of resumed negotiation, no one at that table could return to seeing her as invisible again. The meeting did not end the way it had been intended, not with a signature, not with a confident handshake, but with careful revisions and measured voices, the kind that come when certainty has been replaced by awareness. Papers were reorganized, notes rewritten, and the once fluid momentum now moved with deliberate control. Richard remained seated even as others shifted, his attention no longer scattered across the room, but focused, contained, his gaze drifting once more toward Naomi as she quietly cleared an untouched glass from the edge of the table, her movements unchanged, still precise, still invisible to anyone who chose not to look closely. But now no one at that table could fully ignore her presence, not after what had just unfolded. "Miss Carter," Richard said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without commanding the room. She paused, turning slightly, not startled, not hesitant, simply attentive. "Yes, sir," she replied, the same calm tone she had held all evening. He gestured lightly toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, not a command, not quite an invitation, something in between. "Would you step in for a moment?" he said, the phrasing careful, measured. Naomi glanced at the chair, then back at him, the distance between where she stood and where he indicated holding more meaning than the few feet of space suggested. She walked forward, each step steady, unhurried, and stopped beside the chair without sitting, maintaining the quiet boundary she had carried all night. Richard did not insist. Instead, he opened the folder again, this time turning it toward her slightly, a subtle shift that acknowledged her role without fully redefining it. "If we adjust this phrasing," he said, tapping lightly on the page, "what would you recommend to ensure it remains binding?" The question landed differently than anything he had said before, not dismissive, not testing, but genuine. Naomi lowered her gaze to the document, reading quickly, efficiently, her mind moving through the structure with practiced clarity. "Replace the discretionary verb with a mandatory form," she said, her voice soft but precise. "And remove the conditional modifier so the obligation cannot be reinterpreted." One of the executives leaned in slightly, listening more closely than before. Another made a note without being prompted. Richard watched her as she spoke, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply absorbing. The room had shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to change the roles within it. When she finished, she stepped back slightly, returning the space to him without claiming it. "Thank you," Richard said. The words simple, but not casual. They carried weight because they were not routine for him. Naomi gave a small nod. "You are welcome, sir," she replied, then turned, picking up the empty glass she had paused over earlier, continuing her work without hesitation, without lingering, as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. The conversation resumed once more, but now her input remained present in every line they reviewed, every word they adjusted, even after she had stepped away, and Richard, for the first time that evening, did not try to reclaim the moment as his own. Instead, he let it stand as it was, shaped by someone he had almost dismissed and could no longer overlook. By the time the meeting reached its quiet conclusion, the room no longer carried the same weight it had at the beginning of the evening. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something steadier, more grounded. The revised language now resting clean and precise on the page, each word chosen with intention, each clause locked into place without ambiguity. Richard Whitmore remained seated a moment longer than the others, his hand resting lightly on the finalized document, not gripping it, not claiming it, just acknowledging its presence. The The chandelier above cast a soft reflection across the polished table, catching the edges of the glassware that had been moved, adjusted, used, and left behind, the quiet evidence of everything that had unfolded. Around him, chairs shifted back, low voices exchanged closing remarks, papers gathered, the usual signals of an ending. But Richard did not move immediately, his gaze drifting across the room until it found Naomi again. Now near the service station, arranging a set of clean glasses with the same calm precision she had carried all night, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if the moment had passed without leaving a mark. But he knew it had, not just for the deal, but for him. He stood slowly, the movement measured, controlled, and walked across the room, not quickly, not dramatically, just with purpose, the distance between them closing without urgency. Naomi noticed him only when he was a few steps away, her hands pausing briefly before settling again. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. She turned to face him fully. "Yes, sir," she replied, steady as before. Richard held her gaze for a moment, not searching this time, not measuring, just present. "You saw what none of us did," he said, the words simple, but unguarded. Naomi shook her head slightly. "I saw what was already there," she answered, her tone unchanged, neither modest nor proud, just truthful. Richard let out a quiet breath, the faintest hint of a nod following, as if accepting that answer required less certainty than before. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small card, and placed it gently on the counter between them, not sliding it, not pushing it forward, just setting it down. "If you ever choose to return to that field," he said, "there would be a place for you." The offer was not grand, not theatrical, but it carried weight because it was deliberate. Naomi glanced at the card, then back at him, her eyes steady. "I appreciate that, sir," she said, and for a moment neither of them moved, the quiet stretching between them. Not uncomfortable, not forced, just still. Then Naomi picked up the card and placed it neatly beside the row of glasses, not hidden, not displayed, simply set where it belonged for now. Richard gave one final nod, subtle but certain, and turned away, walking back through the room that no longer felt entirely under his control. As he passed the table, the document rested there, corrected, secured, the outcome changed by a moment he had almost overlooked, and at the edge of the room, Naomi Carter returned to her work, aligning glass after glass under the soft light, her reflection steady in each surface, the quiet rhythm of her movements filling the space where words were no longer needed. And in that silence, something lasting settled into place, not loud, not declared, but undeniable, the kind of recognition that does not demand attention, yet never fades once it is seen. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. In the next video, I will talk about the story Billionaire publicly humiliated the black waitress for being too slow, unaware she was an undercover CIA agent. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.